Pěkný podvečer, dámy a pánové, vítám vás jménem Akce D.O.S.T na dnešních hovorech, které, jak víte, jsou setkáním s Johnem Laughlandem, známým kritikem unijní integrace a autorem i u nás vydané knihy Znečištění pramen, která měla ohlas celoevropských i českých čtenářů. Dříve než předám slovo panu předsedovi Akce D.O.S.T Michalu Semínovi, aby našeho hosta uvítal, rád bych vám řekl několik technických informací. Za prvé víte, že přednáška je v anglickém jazyce, je tlumočena prostřednictvím sluchátek, která jste si měli možnost vyzvednout u vstupu. Pokud tak někdo z vás neučinil a sluchátka potřebuje k tlumočení, tak prosím tam u pana Švejdara, to je ten pán ve světlém svetru u vstupu. Právě tak se na něj obracejte, kdybyste měli nějaký problém s těmi sluchátky, nějaký technický zádrhel, kdyby se vyskytl. Naše dnešní hovory budou jako obvykle sestávat tedy z úvodní přednášky, po které bude krátká, asi 10minutová přestávka a po ní bude následovat diskuse, kde budete moci tedy klást své dotazy, věci. Tak vás ještě jednou vítám a předám vám slovo panu předsedovi Semínovi.
Milí přátelé, mám velikou radost, že dnes mohu pod praporem Akce D.O.S.T přivítat jednoho z nejvýraznějších britských, a nejen britských, konzervativních myslitelů posledních desetiletí, pana Johna Laughlanda. Poprvé jsem se s jeho jménem setkal na stránkách britského časopisu The Spectator. Konkrétně šlo o rozhovor s francouzským politikem Jean-Marie Le Penem. A vzpomínám si, jak Le Pen byl zklamán tím, že jméno našeho hosta se vyslovuje Laughland a nikoli Laughland, což by znamenalo něco na způsob země smíchu, či něco podobného. A i tak ten rozhovor byl nesmírně svěží a v mnoha ohledech vtipný. A tak se mi jméno našeho hosta vrylo do paměti. Sledoval jsem dál, co píše, co publikuje v britských, v amerických, většinou tehdy časopisech. Pak jsem měl tu možnost se s ním seznámit osobně na konferenci v Římě, tuším v roce 2000, a spřátelili jsme se, často píšeme, voláme, ale dnes je to poprvé, co jej mohu představit širšímu českému publiku. Ale ještě než tak učiním, tak si dovolím dvě krátké poznámky, takové postraní. Chtěl bych poděkovat všem, kteří finančně přispěli Akci D.O.S.T a umožnili tak pořádání dnešní přednášky pana Laughlanda. Jmenovitě sdružení Český portál a pivovaru nedávno nebo v květnu otevřeného pivovaru u Tří Růží na Starém Městě. A kdo tak ještě nestačil učinit, a to je ta druhá poznámka, tak to může dnes napravit. Tam u vchodu je košíček u Františka Červenky, tak budeme rádi, když nám také přispějete, abychom podobné akce mohli pořádat i v budoucnu. Pan Laughland, jak Petr Bahník zmínil, je konzervativní myslitel, euroskeptik, autor celé řady knih o mezinárodní politice a politické filozofii. Vystudoval filozofii na univerzitě v Oxfordu, studoval i v Mnichově, následně pak vyučoval na Sorboně a v Paříži. Publikoval již tehdy a dnes stále publikuje. Byl jedním z vysoce postavených zaměstnanců sdružení Evropská nadace, euroskeptické organizace ve Velké Británii. Petr zmínil, že i zde v Čechách vyšla jedna z knížek pana Laughlanda, Znečištění pramen, nedemokratické počátky evropské ideje, zní podtitul. Ta kniha je důležitá, protože poukazuje na historická fakta o tom, že Evropská unie sdílí některé ideové předpoklady, které jsou společné nacismu a komunismu. Pan Laughland si ale všímá dění v Evropě jako součásti širšího trendu globálního sjednocování a vytváření mezinárodních, nadnárodních institucí s pravomocemi překračujícími národní státy. Kritizuje to, jak se dnes zachází s pojmem, s konceptem lidských práv, vytváření nového světového řádu, kritizuje demontáž principu státní suverenity. Byl také jeden z takových nejvýraznějších odpůrců útoku na Jugoslávii v roce 1999 či války proti Iráku, stejně jako praxe ustanovování mezinárodních soudních tribunálů, které soudí údajné válečné zločince. Na to téma napsal knihu. Konkrétně se věnuje tomu procesu s Miloševičem a další velmi zajímavá kniha se jmenuje Historie politických tribunálů, procesu. Ta bohužel ještě v češtině není. Dnes pracuje pan Laughland v Institutu pro demokracii a spolupráci, jež sídlí v Paříži. Českým čtenářům může být znám také jako autor velmi zásadního textu, domnívám se, kdy do sborníku k 70. narozeninám pana prezidenta Václava Klause, s nímž dnes se také setkal, kam přispěl svým příspěvkem nazvaným Od Lenina k Lenonovi. V němž sleduje podobné téma, které bude rozvíjet i v té dnešní přednášce. Čili dovolte mi, abych teď pozval sem k mikrofonu pana Laughlanda. A jak říkal Petr, po přednášce bude krátká přestávka a pak budete mít možnost s ním diskutovat, klást mu otázky. Takže John, please, the floor is yours.
It's always a pleasure to be in Prague. Quite apart from the beauty of the city, the sense of intellectual freedom here is really quite bracing. So it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for your invitation. I would like to speak to you today about the concepts of left and right, and of east and west, and of how these concepts are interlinked.
Není slyšet mikrofon.
It is, I think, obvious that during the Cold War, the East was...
Pětka. Nahoře pětka.
Číslo 5?
Ne.
Máme nějaké pokyny z techniky, jaké to je číslo, nebo tady se... 5. Číslo 5, jo?
Ano.
So I would like to speak about...
Slyšíš?
Can you hear the translation? Yes, very good. So I'd like to speak about the concepts of left and right and east and west, and how they are interlinked. It's obvious, I think, that during the Cold War, the East was left and the West was right. The Communist bloc was the center of a worldwide revolutionary communist organization, while the West was home to regimes which supported or at least tolerated conservative values like religion and personal liberty. Personal liberty, of course, strictly speaking, is a liberal value and therefore neither left nor right. But ever since the early 1980s, it is a value which has been, I think, clearly identified with right-wing regimes, such as those led by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who were convinced that personal liberty would encourage conservative values like hard work, thrift, and patriotism. What I would like to argue this evening, though, is that this simple analysis, that neither the history of the Cold War nor the history of the period after the Cold War can be understood with this simple analysis. I would like to claim instead that the West, during the Cold War, deliberately adopted what we must call a left-wing strategy in its ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. It was determined, in my view, the West was determined, in my view, to present itself as more progressive than its progressivist rival. I want to argue furthermore that this basic left-wing bias of the West has continued after the end of the Cold War, and that now it continues to dictate the West's hostility to a Russia which is attacked precisely as right-wing and reactionary. In order to show this paradox of the way that the roles of left and right have been swapped over, let us start with Marxism itself. I think it's important to remind ourselves that the centrally planned economy and the state ownership of the means of production were never part of original Marxist theory. Many Marxists, indeed, specifically rejected these tenets, these ideas, as we shall see in a minute. The fact that Marxists had no ideological hostility to capitalism when they needed it was proved, I think, by Lenin's readiness to accept Western cash in 1921. When Armand Hammer, the American industrialist and freelance diplomat, visited Moscow in that year, Lenin said, quote, "What we really need," and Hammer describes how his voice rang apparently stronger and his eyes brightened again. "What we really need," Lenin said, "is American capital and technical aid to get our wheels turning once more." Instead of hostility to capitalism, the most, which of course existed, but the most profound thought of Marxism is instead a metaphysical idea, which is clearly expressed in various works of Marxist theory, original Marxist theory, in particular in the Communist Manifesto and in works by Engels, such as the Dialektik der Natur and others. This metaphysical idea, which I repeat, I believe to be the ideological foundation of Marxism, is the idea that there is no fixed reality, that there is no such thing as truth, and that instead everything is in a state of permanent flux. In Ludwig Feuerbach, at the end of German philosophy, Engels wrote this, and I quote, "All successive historical systems are only transitory stages in the endless course of the development of human society from the lower to the higher. Each stage is necessary and therefore justified for the time and conditions to which it owes its origin. But in the face of new higher conditions, which gradually develop in its own womb, it loses vitality and justification. It must give way to a higher stage, which will also, in its turn, decay and perish. Just as the bourgeoisie, by large-scale industry, competition, and the world market, dissolves in practice all stable, time-honored institutions, so this dialectical philosophy dissolves all conceptions of final, absolute truth and of absolute states of humanity corresponding to it. For dialectical philosophy, nothing is final, absolute or sacred. It reveals the transitory character of everything and in everything. Nothing can endure before it except the uninterrupted process of becoming and of passing away, of endless ascendancy from the lower to the higher." End of quotation. This metaphysics we should call Heracliteanism, in memory of the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who said that everything was in a state of permanent flux. Marx and Engels, as it happens, drew their inspiration on this, in large measure from Charles Darwin, who claimed to offer a scientific basis for this metaphysics. And indeed, many senior Darwinists, including a future director of the Natural History Museum, were present among the small group of mourners who met around Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery in London on a cold morning in March 1883. But the logical consequence of this metaphysics was that nothing is fixed in the political realm either. Engels wrote about this very clearly. I'll quote again. The disintegration of mankind into a mass of isolated, mutually repelling atoms in itself means the destruction of all corporate, national, and indeed of any particular interests, and is the last necessary step towards the free and spontaneous association of man. In other words, not only is reality unfixed, but also the attempt to fix things in the political realm is the source of unfreedom. Freedom exists for Marx and Engels only when there is pure freedom of association, and this means the end of the state. The state is conceived in Marx and Engels purely as a vertical, authoritarian structure of power, which constrains the otherwise free association of humans. Lenin was to write very clearly about this, the doctrine that came to be known as the withering away of the state. Lenin said, I quote, "So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. When there will be freedom, there will be no state." End of quotation. This belief that the state is nothing but an instrument of repression is therefore, in my opinion, one of the principal tenets of left-wing ideology. It was born in the French Revolution. It was born in the philosophy of Rousseau, who, as you know, wrote, "Man is born free and everywhere is in chains." And the French Revolution was itself predicated on the universalist notion that hierarchical political structures must be abolished and that the social contract must be invented anew and based only on human desire, on human volition, and that therefore the state's form could not be accepted as a historically given fact. This desire to see the end of the state is one of the reasons why the authors of the Communist Manifesto, surprisingly, welcomed the revolutionary force of the free market. Another quotation, this time from the Communist Manifesto. I quote, "Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." The quotation continues. "The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. That's my last long quotation. It's not the last. It's not the last quotation, it's the last long quotation. I'm sure you know the next quotation. The worker, Marx and Engels wrote, has no country. The worker has no country. National differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market. So, whereas the left stands for universal principles and therefore for universal forms of political arrangement, based on the allegedly universal materialistic needs of man and on the allegedly universal materialistic laws of economics, the right, by contrast, stands for the particular and the local and that which is historically given, and therefore for the state. Based as it is, based as the state is, on inherited and not on invented, contingent, historical and geographical origins. Although, of course, universal things may inhere in these particular states. This idea of the importance of the state was already explicit in the philosophy of the greatest philosopher of counter-revolution, Edmund Burke, who attacked the abstract principles of the French Revolution in favour of what he called the little platoon of existing societies, of really existing societies. He denounced abstraction in favour of reality. Now, it's obvious that this opposition between left and right has had a decisive influence on the flow of European politics ever since the French Revolution. But it is through this prism of universalism against particularism and of cosmopolitanism against nationalism, or more precisely attachment to the nation as one's extended family, that we should, in my opinion, analyse the Cold War and what has happened since. So this is why I make my first claim, which I've already said, that the Cold War was fought by the West from a left-wing perspective. It decided to fight the ideological battle with communism on communism's own ideological ground, by showing that it, the West, was more progressive and more successfully materialistic than the allegedly progressive and materialistic regime in the East. The West was also determined to show that it was freer, specifically in the sense of being free, of course, of a communist state denounced not only as totalitarian, but also as paternalistic, authoritarian, and socially conservative. The West did not argue that it was more patriotic or religious than the East. You'll recall that Nikita Khrushchev foolishly launched a prosperity race with the United States when, having abandoned Stalinism, he told US President Richard Nixon in July 1959, Vice President, sorry, at that stage, that the USSR would catch up America in 7 years and then overtake it. Khrushchev said, We will overtake America, and then as we pass, wave bye-bye. If you've ever seen the video, it's very amusing, because Khrushchev clearly dominates the encounter with Nixon. Well, the West took up the communist challenge and won. Part of this strategy involved recruiting leftists in the West who hated the Soviet Union because of Stalin, but not because of Marxism. The first in line for such recruitment were obviously Trotskyites, who hated Stalin's apparent nationalism and hated his abandonment of world revolution in favor of socialism in one country. I've argued in other articles that one can see in Stalin's expulsion of Trotsky in 1929, at least symbolically speaking, a reply to the fateful decision taken by the German imperial staff to send Lenin to the Finland station in 1917. You may know that Churchill said that this decision to send Lenin, he said it was a decision taken by the Germans, quote, in the same way that you might send a phial containing a culture of typhoid or cholera to be poured into the water supply of a great city, and it worked with amazing accuracy. So Churchill saw Lenin, the sending of Lenin to the Soviet Union, as a sort of injection of an ideological poison. Well, we might say Stalin returned the compliment, because Trotsky was expelled in his turn, and the deadly poison of Trotskyism did take root in the West. The CIA and other agencies in the West specifically recruited leftists for their cultural war with the Soviet Union. Throughout the Cold War, they didn't need to recruit right-wing people, because right-wing people were already anti-communist. So they targeted leftists, social democrats and others, who were susceptible to such recruitment. And that is why CIA-backed artists like Nicholas Nabokov and Jackson Pollock explicitly used modernism in their art for anti-Soviet purposes, while the Committee for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA body set up to wage this cultural war with the Soviets, pushed forward modernists in other fields as well, such as the atonal music of Arnold Schoenberg, in order to portray the West as more liberated and anti-authoritarian than the Soviet regime, which supported the more classical music of Shostakovich and the supposed kitsch of socialist realist painting. Now, this process accelerated and indeed exploded, I would say, with the revolution of the 1960s. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the leader of the events of May 1968, said, I quote, "The French tricolour is there to be torn up." That revolution in Paris was specifically a revolution against the figure of General de Gaulle. In other words, against the values of nationhood, heroism, and authority. But its message, the message of Paris in May 68, was taken up by people who were later to take an ideological, a leading role in the ideological fight against the Soviet regime. From figures like Václav Havel, who is a pure product of 1968, Prague as opposed to Paris, to free market liberals like Alain Madelin, a former French finance minister, who, having initially belonged to an extreme right-wing anti-communist organisation, Occident, which means the West, later went on to declare, I quote, "Liberalism," which he supports, "is a philosophy of the sovereignty of the person and not the state. The sovereign state is the enemy." This is a Western liberal speaking. Now, in the 1980s, this process received an unexpected boost from the movements of financial liberalisation, which were initiated by Margaret Thatcher and which soon swept across the whole world. Mrs. Thatcher declared that she wanted to roll back the frontiers of the state. She meant that she wanted free market liberalisation and less state control over the economy. She never meant to dismantle the British state as such. But in my view, her slogan and her policies unleashed processes which later she could not control. In particular, the European Single Market Project, which was launched by the Single European Act in 1986, strongly supported by Mrs. Thatcher, and which was programmed to culminate in 1992, the year when the Soviet Union eventually did disappear. This project of the European Single Market was used by European federalists and post-nationalists and Jacques Delors precisely to roll back the frontiers of the nation-state. In other words, the ideology of the market became an anti-national ideology. I think you only have to look at the careers of the most emblematic figures in European politics over the last few decades to see that this is true. So many of those people who have either held power or wielded influence or both in the last 2 decades in European politics, and who are energetic advocates of the end of the nation state through the free market or through the right to intervene, many of these people are products of the various anti-Stalinist but left-wing and revolutionary or Marxist or neo-Marxist movements of the late 1960s and the early 1970s. We could mention Daniel Cohn-Bendit himself, whose name I've already talked about, who of course is a prominent member of the European Parliament. Bernard Kouchner, a former communist, who is the founder of the ideologically interventionist organization Médecins du Monde, and who wielded post-national power as High Representative in Kosovo before becoming Foreign Minister in the first government formed by the supposedly free market and Atlanticist President Nicolas Sarkozy. José Manuel Barroso, the President of the European Commission, was, as a young man, the President of the student branch of the Maoist reorganized movement of the Party of the Proletariat during the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974. Václav Havel, in the 1960s, a famous promoter of free love, world peace, and the end of the nation-state. Or any number of fashionable intellectuals, like Bernard-Henri Lévy, Jürgen Habermas, or André